Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Delightful to have you here at this session on cultural hegemony, language, and the politics of forgetting, interrogating restrictive language policies. As I am often found in the situation of having to introduce two people who need no introduction at all, I begin by introducing myself. I'm Jerry Schroff. I work for AERA, and I'm happy to be standing in for Ruben Donato, who cannot make it to the session. And delighted mostly because I'm introducing two people that I've previously not known at all, but as I got busy on Wikipedia and Google, I've learned some things about them that I'm quite attracted to, and I'm sure you're going to have a very wonderful session. Dr. Darden, Antonio Darden, is currently a professor at Loyola University in Los Angeles, but as previously, at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, previously and is now a professor emeritus of the Education Policy Organization and Leadership Center at the University of Illinois. It won't be surprising to tell you that her work features the contributions of Paulo Freire and application of his work to contemporary education issues. I was delighted to find that in one of her statements about Dr. Darden referred to her as a political intellectual, and the key of that is that our theme for next year that the president of the association is working on is focusing on the role of education researchers as political intellectuals. So you're ahead of the curve on that one. And the other thing is that she's been working in the past with the National Education Policy Center, which is a favorite group of mine, and I commend to your attention, based in Arizona. We have a presentation which will talk about some of the work of Paulo Freire, and then we have a respondent who is, I'm going to have trouble with this, Joel. Help me. You with your name? Joel, who's at the University of Massachusetts, where he's the chair of the Department of Education Leadership. And so we have presentations that are going to be focused on the relationship of culture, education, leadership, and language. In closing, I'd like to just say that Dr. Darden's work includes several books that have intriguing titles, and I'm sure are intriguing themselves. One is Culture and Power in the Classroom. Another is A Pedagogy of Love, and she's co-author of a book called Race, and Racism After Multiculturalism, and that probably is enough. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Can you all hear me all right? Yeah? Yes? Okay. I think there's a way to put a light here. You guys have been very, very patient as we're trying to figure out how to put this light on, so I don't have to strain my eyes. I want to say I'm very appreciative that you're here. I think that one of the frustrations that I want to speak about in a lot of ways is related to this, to all of the work that so many of us do. That after 30 years of being a scholar, finally having a presentation at AERA that specifically deals with the issue of the theme of the conference, and I'm put on the last day, and it's just, sure, everybody has to be in the last day, but you know, after 30 years, you think the work would find a place, and I think it's more of a message about what happens to those of us that are willing to keep standing up and keep asking for a truly democratic society, a society that truly engages the needs of all people in very substantive ways, both socially and materially. So I think I have to say that so that I can kind of calm down and let you know that my name is Antonia Darder, and that that even what we get called, we go through our lives struggling with the fact that we have to always tell people how to say our names, and we don't think about that. It's not, nobody thinks about how that has an impact about, just how we always quite not feel at home. And it isn't to be in any way, Jerry, disparaging.
I am paying attention.
Yeah, no, it isn't meant that way. It's meant more in a larger sense, because it's more about the manner in which we are not prepared, really, truly, to be a diverse society. And so the outcome is that we struggle. All of us struggle with that, and this is one example of it. So anyway, I'm going to get started, and I'm seeing the clock moving here. All right, we'll get going. And I'm very happy you're here, is what I want to say. Italian Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci wrote, "Each time the question of language surfaces, in one way or another, it means that a series of other problems are coming to the fore: the formation and enlargement of the managing class, the need to establish more intimate and secure relationships between the governing group and the national popular mass, in other words, to reorganize cultural democracy. An enduring legacy of cultural hegemony and racialized language policies associated with centuries of colonialism has resulted in a long history of protracted language struggles around the world. In concert, the common practice of nation-states to oppress language minority populations persists today. This is particularly evident when policymakers deem restrictive language policies essential to national unity or to national security. In 2011, Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction John Huppenthal blocked under an assumed name, which was discovered, "We all need to stomp out balkanization. No Spanish radio stations, no Spanish billboards, no Spanish TV stations, no Spanish newspapers. This is America. Speak English," he demanded. "I don't mind them selling Mexican food as long as the menus are mostly in English, and this doesn't mean I'm racist." More often than not, the repression of linguistic minorities is also associated with the belief that these populations are problematic to capitalist accumulation. To ensure that the other is well subordinated into the system of production, racialized institutional policies and practices in school, workplace, and schools in society have prevailed. Policies and practices associated with longstanding nativist sentiments of Americanization, which have supported the miseducation, mass incarceration, deportation, and genocide of racialized populations in this country. Historian Michael Wood estimates that during the period of colonial expansion, tens of thousands of indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere became victims of brutality of European colonization. By the late 1500s, scarcely 2 million remained on the entire hemisphere. An average of 1 million people perished annually throughout the 16th century in what Chicano historian Gilbert Gonzalez has called the greatest genocide in human history. The destructive historical legacy and its transgenerational impact have remained well hidden in what Joan Parasquiva, drawing from the writings of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, terms curricular epistemicide, which involves the preparation of urban teachers, many who are often expected to work with students from minority language communities. Included in this analysis are also indigenous students and African American students whose cultural languages in many instances were repressed or annihilated. Writing about the history of restrictive language policies, James Crawford noted that Native American languages were targeted for extinction as part of a federal policy of cultural genocide. The 1868 Indian Peace Commission made a number of recommendations on how to subjugate Western tribes, and he concluded, "In the difference of language today lies 2/3 of our trouble. Schools should be established with which children could be required to attend. Their barbarous dialects should be blotted out and the English language substituted. Through the sameness of language is produced a sameness of sentiment and thought. Customs and habits are molded and assimilated in the very same way. Oppressive notions persist in the schooling of working-class children of color who are still racialized as much for the color of their skin as the language spoken in their communities. Indigenous scholar Andrea Baer Nichols poignantly argued that linguistic genocide may sooner or later be specifically identified as a crime against humanity is heartening. But considering the imminent extinction of so many indigenous languages, it may simply not matter in the case of most languages. The world's languages are dying off at an alarming rate. Of the estimated 6,000 known languages in the world, more than half are expected to become extinct by the end of the century, with only 10% considered to have any kind of a secure future. Daniel Nettles and Suzanne Romain report that today only 100 languages remain and are spoken by 90% of the world's population. With this in mind, Toves Skatnapkangas argued that the majority of language communities over the last 100 years have become victims of linguistic genocide, a phenomenon where the language is killed rather than the people. She correctly links this phenomenon to ruling class forces within nation states that seek to destroy potential competition for political and economic power in order to eliminate claims of nation states among indigenous people and other language minority populations. However, linguistic genocide is not solely a U.S. phenomenon. It is an international concern linked to human rights. Racism in the form of restrictive language policies in Spain have historically oppressed the Basque, Gallegos, and Catalans, and more recently, Moroccan immigrants are routinely stopped and searched while educators debate furiously the drain these students have on educational resources and the need for their quick assimilation. Similar conditions exist for working-class immigrant populations in Germany and Switzerland and England. The Kurds in Turkey will still struggle for their rights to cultural and linguistic self-determination, and the Roma immigrants, whom many people call gypsies, have been racialized in every single country that they have tried to settle. The phenomenon also endures in the lives of indigenous populations worldwide. In Australia, New Zealand, Aboriginal and Maori communities persist in long-fought efforts to retain cultural and language rights. In the U.S., the geopolitics of Native Hawaiians and other indigenous populations encompass ardent struggles to protect their languages and cultures from extinction. But these are examples of communities that have managed to survive. Sadly, the majority have not. From a slightly different vantage point, linguistic genocide was at work in the plight of enslaved African Americans separated from their families and forced into slave labor. American Indians who suffered the loss of much of their land and had their children arbitrarily removed and subjected to forced assimilation tactics of English-speaking boarding schools, and Chicano, Puerto Rican, and Chinese workers exploited for cheap labor whose children were subjected to repressive educational practices that silenced their mother tongue. Etienne Balabar, his notion of election selection signals an ideological justification of empire building that accompanies cultural and linguistic oppression. He suggested that the historical notion of election to rule is used to substitute or substantiate, the right of ruling class to govern over those populations that are deemed inferior and that are selected for disposal, those considered a threat to nation states. Underpinning this colonizing discourse are unexamined assumptions of the others that links to the hidden curriculum of restrictive language policies in conjunction with citizenship rights. One of my greatest frustrations is that people will go to hear somebody talk about racism, or they'll go, but they don't recognize that the issue of language, lingual racism, is absolutely like the first point of assimilation and the first point of contact in terms of destroying cultural communities. With an eye on the 2016 election, ultra-conservative Ann Coulter offers her new book, Adios America, the left's plan to turn on our country into a third world. Coulter, I'm sorry. Ay, Dios mío. Coulter calls for, in violation, actually, of the Voting Act of 1965, Coulter calls for English-only ballots and literacy tests before a person can exercise their voting rights. In her mind, the ability to speak English somehow guarantees voters will not be ignorant. Coulter also echoes the opposition of multilingual ballots that was voiced by John Silber, President Emeritus of Boston University, during his 1996 testimony in Congress. He said, bilingual ballots degrade the very concept of the citizen to that of someone lost in a country whose public discourse is incomprehensible to him. This points to the manner in which the coloniality of power persists long after the initial colonial moment, anchoring the hegemonic language within the universal eugenic claim that its epistemology is uniquely superior and the highest cognitive formulation of human existence. Differences in Eurocentric epistemology of the West then comprise a deep sense of innate superiority in comparison to the inferiority of those who are seen as other. With this tight binary, Santos argues there is simply no genuine equality possible, in that equality can only exist in sameness. In other words, I'll give you equality if you can perform in sameness, or at least aspire to sameness. And yet, while on one hand an assumption of inferiority of the subaltern is perpetuated, it is the subaltern who are expected to learn the language of the colonizer. A deep contradiction belies the truth here. Rather than inferior, our children have proven themselves equally as intelligent, if not more at times, in that many excel despite huge linguistic, epistemological, and material obstacles. The recalcitrant epistemology of domination in schools today can also be linked to Western religious influences. One such is the biblical myth of the Tower of Babel, where linguistic differences are ideologized as God's punishment. Nadel and Romain note this notion conveniently justifies early scientific beliefs about anthropologists who embrace linguistic Darwinism, predicting that the language of savages, and these terms that I'm using are all actually documented, that somehow savages would amalgamate until one day there would exist but one superior language spoken by all on the planet. Balabar further noted that these attitudes are inscribed in the belief that human civilization is expected to strive for divine transcendence over a hellish animalism. It is not surprising, then, that the policy debates outside the Eurocentric English-speaking, these policy debates tend to bring about a kind of burden on those who are seen as others, that we should prove ourselves as decent human beings, worthy of entrance into the inner sanctum of American citizenship. Similarly, exclusionary policy practices or public policy discourses throughout the U.S. and its history have often employed derogatory animalistic references to speak of the intellectual, linguistic, phenotypical, sexual, or cultural practices of impoverished non-Europeans. In Documents of American Prejudice, Yoshi compiled a series of historical documents that substantiate this claim. For example, John Box, a minister in the U.S. representative from Texas, addressed Congress on February 1928 to demand strong restrictive language policies. And he argued very passionately that the Mexican is a mixture of Mediterranean blood, Spanish peasant with low-grade Indians who did not fight to extinction but submitted and multiplied like serfs. This blend of low-grade Spaniard, peonized Indian, and Negro slaves mixed with Negro mulattoes and other mongrels and some sorry whites already here, the prevention of mongrelization and degradation it causes is one of the purposes of our laws, which the admission of these people will tend to defeat. Every incoming race causes blood mixture, but if this were not true, a mixture of blocks of people of different races has a bad effect upon citizenship, creating more race conflicts and weakening national character. Media debates on the problem of immigration bilingual education or ethnic studies over the last decade have not been any less racializing. Racialized newspaper, television, and film portrayals still show poor, immigrant, and racialized populations as uncivilized, ignorant, or dangerous. The persistence of such colonial hostility raises serious concerns regarding the future of language rights and the impact of restrictive language policies among a national population that is quickly becoming culturally and linguistically more diverse. When I was a child growing up in East Los Angeles, we were prohibited of speaking, to speak Spanish in school. Teachers would wash our mouth out with soap or isolate us in a dark cloakroom or sit us in the hallways as punishment for violating the unwritten English-only rule. To discourage our parents from speaking to us in our native tongue, they were told that Spanish was not good for us, that it would interfere with our learning and surely be the cause of our academic failure in the future. So the question of language, as articulated by Italian Marxist Gramsci, has existed as a very real part of my everyday life since birth, given my cultural formation as a colonized subject in the United States. My experience as a Spanish-speaking Puerto Rican child reflected the debilitating phenomena of linguistic racialization still faced today by many language minority children in our communities. These are children still subjected daily to colonizing linguistic practices here and abroad, where the ideology of cultural hegemony persists. In the process, language minority children are unmercifully ushered into a culture of forgetting, pedagogical spaces of the banking method of education, as Freire would call it, where students are expected to reject their native language uncritically, adopt the language and cultural system imposed by the dominant culture of schooling. Restrictive language policies promote a culture of forgetting, whether through an authoritarian curriculum of coercion or a liberal humanistic pedagogy of individualism and false generosity, which shroud the hegemonic function of education. The consequence is that our kids are bled dry of what truly counts. Instead of a humanizing pedagogy that engages the multidimensionality of their collective beings, the emphasis is placed on an assimilative language curriculum that both alienates and estranges. As such, U.S. education is part of a persistent colonial web even today. Accordingly, students' cultural and linguistic allegiances are eroded as the official language, culture, and identity of the nation-state is reinforced. In the process, hegemonic language practices thwart voice, self-determination, and social agency. Schools, as zones of cultural forgetting, violently resist memories of belonging, erase cultural histories, seek to fade cultural community ties, and gradually strip our children's intimate cultural bonds to our ancestral knowledge, leaving our children defenseless against epistemicides, depriving them of the cognitive anchor that neurologically links them to their cultural knowledge. Knowledge that would best assist them at this point to resist critically and to become literate and involved as empowered subjects of their own histories. Instead, our children are steered towards estranged roles as consumer citizens, both dependent and in service to the political economy of the nation, a nation that has historically ignored our human needs and indiscriminately used our people as disposable peons of an exploitive labor market. Nowhere is this formulation has there been a genuine intention to transform the structures and structural conditions of inequality experienced by language minority populations beyond the mythic aspiration to individual material success as the measure of human value. As would be expected, many bilingual students and their parents internalize racializing projections and thus strive to disassociate from their primary language and culture. Many can experience shame and with their own difference. In some instances, children may even refuse to speak the primary language in their family, insisting on answering and speaking to their parents in English, already perceived in their young minds as the language of power. So powerful is the hegemony of English in the United States and abroad that it is not unusual to hear the laments of Latinos, of Hawaiians, of Native Americans, or other immigrant parents who fear their cultural relationships with their children are eroding as their children are primed to pursue limited worlds of English-only dreams. In these ways, restrictive language policies in schools have effectively functioned in the service of language racialization and convenient pedagogical vehicles of language control. I want to go on to the politics of restrictive language. The language of instruction, curricular epistemology, and the pedagogy of schooling constitutes powerful terrains of struggle. In other words, we're involved in a struggle. We've got to understand that the issue here is that those policies and practices that our children are subjected to are having a negative impact. And we have to understand that historically, because the tendency is to think, oh, well, slavery happened, way back then, or colonization way back then, as if the very paradigm under which people were enslaved and colonized was not still at work today. In the mid-'80s, for example, Ernest Boyer, former president for the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, so celebrated for his neoliberal-friendly scholarship of engagement, appealed to American public opinion to rethink its stance on allowing non-English-speaking foreigners to immigrate into the United States. He noted that the national community's social tensions were now signified by bilingual education, a code word that he argued had turned schools into the battleground of the nation. Boyers echoes old notions that deem cultural and linguistic differences a fundamental threat to the very stability and unity of the nation. Ira Zavala, in her book, Colonialism and Culture, suggests that the reason for this perception of threat is the central role that language and culture play in the conservation of the nation state. Language and culture are used within the dominant society to create an illusion of cohesion or the appearance of stability in a world always in flux. Efforts to fortify this illusion of stability is heavily intensified during historical periods of political, economic crisis and military expansionism. And this has happened all through the history of the U.S. Both these conditions steadily increased at different moments during the last 2 decades, with massive layoffs of workers across the country, economic destabilization, and increasing military intervention overseas. In 1996, for example, in the midst of increasing immigration, particularly from Mexico and other parts of Latin America, Congress ratified a bill to designate English the federal government's official language of business. This was the first time in U.S. history that any form of official federal language policy had been instituted. Coincidentally, it was the same year that Ron Unst's corporate-backed campaign for Proposition 227, or English for the Children, was initiated. The passage of Proposition 227 overrode the 1974 Law versus Nichols decision in California and systematically stripped away the legal rights of language minority children to learn in their mother tongue, redirecting them into English-only classrooms. A decade later in Arizona, rising anti-immigrant fervor in the state fueled contentious calls for restrictive language and immigrant policies to curtail the movement of immigrant residents, to eliminate the use of Spanish in the workplace and shut down ethnic studies programs. These 3 approaches were engaged. In 2010, Arizona finally passed SB 1070 that resulted in both homogenizing and criminalizing Mexicans and Chicanos in Arizona, whether documented or undocumented. Aguirre argues in concert with Zavala that the ballot initiative process was driven by the public's enhanced perception of Mexicans or immigrants as a threat to the social and cultural fabric of the U.S., echoing old imperialist claims. So we think that stuff happened like way out there. We're talking about the last decade in Arizona. It is also significant to note that restrictive policy initiatives in Arizona intensified not only in the midst of major economic recession and increasing military intervention overseas, but also at the very moment that the demographics data begins to reveal that Arizona's white population has lost its majority edge. For many theorists studying the political relationship of racism and demographics, the impact of this shift in Arizona is noteworthy in that, according to population projections, there are many significant regions of the country that are expected to undergo a similar ethnic shift in the next 25 years. And essentially, that's what you're seeing there. If you look at the point that the white population is no longer the majority, we begin to see these restrictive policies coming into place. Coincidence? This is when I want to have like a good joke, you know. Ay, Diosito. Okay. Intensification of restrictive language policies have also been fueled by conservative political gatekeepers who often allege that undocumented immigrants take away jobs from the U.S. citizens, right? Lower property taxes, threaten law and order, consume education and welfare resources, and now constitute this national security risk. Many of these misleading public debates center on the need for a tighter patrol of the U.S.-Mexico border, yet what is seldom mentioned is that the U.S.-Canada border is far more porous and thus more accessible to crossing without documentation. And, what I want to show here, the photographs, is how different those two borders look. So, it seems to me like it gives a message about who this country is concerned about coming in and who they very want to make sure that they keep out. Paulo Freire and Donaldo Macedo have asserted that institutional policies to restrict minority language development and its uses, as well as its efforts to curtail rituals or cultural practices of people, function in the interests of cultural invasion and the erosion of primary language. Over time, hegemonic policies tied to the restriction of both education and labor markets function to normalize the loss of primary culture and language in immigrant and indigenous populations. In the book Vanishing Voices, The Extinction of the World's Languages, Nettles and Romain conclude that the radical restructuring of human societies, which has led to the dominance of English and a few other world languages, is not a case of the survival of the fittest, nor the outcome of competition or free choice among equals in an idealized free marketplace. It is instead the result of an unequal social change resulting in striking disparities in resources. Therefore, as with other forms of social oppression, linguistic oppression is non-local or unfixed in nature, prevailing across the entire system. But it becomes localized and materialized in students and workers from racialized communities who are seen as deficient and in need of being fixed. In essence, language minority communities have served as the handy scapegoats for shrouding the impunity of U.S. capitalism and its racializing imperative. The expression of this economic scapegoating is akin to demonizing and blaming immigrants for the lack of decent jobs, the problems of the educational system, and the high cost of health care, along with increasing reliance and allegiance to meritocratic practices of high-stakes testing. Our children are handed a life sentence of deficiency and baptized into a lifelong political invisibility and impoverishment. I want to, one of the pieces that I'm trying to make here is that language and material interests are connected, that it's not just a matter about learning one language or another. The issues of power are implicated here, and as a result, issues of the material are implicated. We can't deal with language, we can't deal with any form of democracy without dealing with the question of material conditions and material inequalities. The ideology of racism that informs restrictive language policies constitutes an inherently political strategy of social exclusion, domination, exploitation that cannot be extricated from its economic imperative, whether discussing questions of academic achievement or larger concerns tied to language rights or a living wage. These are all interconnected. Segregation, for example, as an outcome of the racialization and class reproduction is firmly entrenched within a wider systemic necessity of capitalist modes of production that fuels restrictive policies and practices within schools and the labor market in an effort to sustain the interests of capital and simultaneously veil the economic consequences that policies produce. So, it's a lot easier to blame communities, poor folks, linguistic minority communities. It's a lot easier to blame those folks for the problems in the nation than really deal with the fact that we have a horrendous situation economically, where the majority of the resources are going to a very small percentage of the population. And so it's easier if you create these kind of myths, and that we as educators, talking about research, we as educators perpetuate them when we don't try to get at the root of what is going on. And if we don't look at it historically, politically, economically, ideologically, we've got to engage in these multiple ways. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we come out with these fractured notions about how to solve the problem. And as we've seen, we have been struggling with these questions for more than 40 years, in particularly in relationship to, if we think about the civil rights, from civil rights, people have been struggling with these issues long before that. But this concentrated effort, and yet we still find ourselves in right now, the gap between the rich and the poor is worse than it was in 1968. The reason for this is that the power and meaning behind language policies and practices can only be grasped when brought together in relationship to the material society. This means that our theorizing of linguistic inequality must be solidly grounded in an analysis and critique of capitalist society. This materialist reading of language as social phenomena opens the theoretical space for language rights to be understood within the context of existing social and economic conditions, the very conditions from which we must struggle to transform educational injustice. This is to say that we must move beyond a fixed binary of difference to a dialectical understanding where social and material conditions are deemed central to our research on language and on education. Socioeconomic conditions, for example, produce gross racialized inequalities such as lack of jobs, security, insufficient income for people to care for their families, high youth unemployment, the demise of better jobs, lack of health care, expanding poverty, increasing incarceration. I mean, we talk about all of these issues as if they were not interrelated. And what I want to keep coming back to is that they are absolutely interrelated. Yet conditions of political and economic inequality ensure greater incidences of residential segregation, for example, which has been found to be a significant factor in the education of language minority kids. Gary Orfield and his associates at the Civil Rights Project have concluded that not only is school segregation greater than in 1968, our children generally attend the poorest and most segregated schools with the least experienced teachers. Moreover, their students are taught predominantly in English-only classrooms and thus more likely to struggle with the process of homeschool linguistic transition than it's a sense that there's never this understanding that our kids come in fundamentally already with a paradigm of thinking and making sense of the world. It's in a different language, and it may often epistemologically it is also different. So their cognitive way of engaging is different. I always tell this story that when I was a Head Start nurse, I was asked to be the interpreter for the speech therapist, and he would show these four pictures. Many of you know the baby, the Peabody, I think, part of the baby Wexler, but then this one once was Peabody, I'm pretty sure, and they had 4 pictures on it. And one of them was a doctor, a dentist, so a postman, and I think a filling station, a guy filling station. And so the kids were asked, okay, and we're talking about babies, right? We're talking about 3- and 4-year-olds. They were asked, how are these pictures the same? What is the same in these pictures? And the kids, I don't have time to stop and ask you, but I want to ask you, what do you think is the same? If you had the picture, you would have to think, right? So the right answer, the correct answer is that they're all men. Invariably, when I gave this, when I did the translation for the Spanish-speaking kids, the kids would say, oh, they all help us. And you might not think, you think like, oh, well, how cute, But what I'm trying to say is not just about how cute. It has to do with how they were making sense of the world. The object relation that they are all men was not what was important to the little kids. That's not what they were seeing. The first thing they were seeing was the relational aspect of it, that these were all folks who helped us. Accordingly, research belies claims that immersion in English-only classrooms radically improve student performance. In fact, follow-up studies by Thomas and Collier show no considerable improvement in rates of English acquisition in these English-only classrooms. In addition, what cannot be overlooked here is the loss of bilingual education rights, which once were afforded to our children. With the loss of bilingual education, our children are more often than not exposed to debilitating assimilative practices of education in English-only approaches, legitimated under the guise of evidence-based instructional practices focused on the instrumental development of English skills and a teach-to-the-test curriculum at the expense of those epistemological strengths that are held in the primary culture and the primary language. Unfortunately, in the neoliberal age, public welfare concerns have been redefined primarily along economic interests in ways that abdicate the nation-state's responsibility to adequately educate all our children attending U.S. schools. So there's this sense that, if kids are smart, they should all learn. So the language is not the issue. Instead, a sink or swim epistemology tied to the ethos of free market enterprise has effectively snubbed linguistic rights debates within the arena of educational language policies. I'm going to move forward because I know we're moving. Let me see. I'm just because... You guys, I can't tell you, there's this part that just, I've been dealing with this for so many years, and I know some of you out here have been dealing with this question for many, many years, and the frustration is, how do you get folks, to make the connections? Because sometimes it's almost like if people haven't lived the connection, it's hard for them to make the connection. And so the consequence is they make the connection at such superficial levels that they don't realize the impact of the negative impact that it's having on our children. I'm going to go to slide 38. However, given restrictive language policies at work and insufficient preparation for most teacher education programs, classroom teachers alone cannot be held responsible. So I'm not trying to bash teachers here. I'm saying that it's a much larger problem than just the fact that, teachers may not be getting the best teacher education program with respect to language minority kids. I think that big changes need to happen, but we can't just bash teachers for that. It is striking to note that the last 2 decades as well, paying jobs in the United States have begun to disappear in the wake of globalizing interests and shock doctrine economics. Exclusionary, restrictive language policies along immigrant debates have surged. As a consequence, deep racialized resentments were generated by job scarcity and perceptions of competition between working class and immigrant populations. Contradictory class attitudes in the U.S. are also widespread. For example, white elite private schools place an increasing emphasis on the development of bilingual language skills for global citizenship, and wealthy transnational corporations are sending their high-ranking employees to Latin America, China, or other countries to learn a second language so they may compete more readily within the global marketplace. But English language learners in U.S. public schools who most readily could develop bilingual skills are forced into English-only classrooms. Similarly, affluent public schools offer gifted students programs in Spanish and Japanese and Chinese, while these opportunities are seldom found in low-income schools where most language minority students attend and where little systematic effort is placed on developing their already existing bilingual abilities. For working class children from subordinate language communities, racism and class inequalities converge to entrap them within this culture of forgetting, disabling their development as empowering bicultural, bilingual subjects of their history, and as such, they interfere with their self-determination and the very exercise of cultural democracy. So I want to just kind of go through this last section, which is this notion of moving beyond this politics of forgetting. So Lilia Bartolomé has correctly stressed that the need to recognize the significance of ideology in education in light of a brutal colonial history of language imposition is at work here. She insists that we must comprehend the hegemonic implications of language erosion beyond individual choice or the practical inducements of English for academic and labor gains. So there's always this, they have to, we need to assimilate them, because otherwise they're not going to get jobs. Well, the crazy thing is that a bunch of our folks in our community are not able to find jobs anyway. I mean, we're not even dealing with the way in which the very job market has shifted. So even when people we have never had as many people with bachelor's degrees and master's degrees that are unemployed as we do today. How about if we have that conversation? And in what ways is there not some kind of a relationship happening between education and the larger society in terms of the well-being of folks? Language, like culture, then, is often considered to be independent and self-existent, objectified as if it were some kind of a coat that you just put on, right, or off. This objectification of knowledge results in perpetuating both fragmented and reductive educational notions and language practices. Sonia Nieto has noted that the views of language as a purely mechanical device or solely as signifiers of national allegiance must be decentered. Educators then must engage with the powerful reality that language, political power, and economics are inextricably linked to the epistemological and ideological formation of the nation state, and as such, language functions as a fundamental human resource for the construction of meaning and the establishment of relationships across private and public spaces. Thus, to restrict language is to restrict the very expression of our humanity. This is precisely the experience of many of our kids from linguistically racialized populations when they enter a classroom where the supremacy of English functions not only against their academic well-being, but their access to cognitive justice. Upon entering the English-only classroom, our kids are often rendered voiceless in a foreign sound system and epistemological prison that does not afford them a place for self-expression or self-determination. And often, when these children do learn English, stereotypical perceptions of their deficiency persist, denying them meaningful opportunities to participate in ways that English-proficient students readily enjoy in the process of their academic formation. Without these opportunities, the ability of English learners to succeed in school is overwhelmingly compromised as they struggle every single day, doubly, not only to learn the grade level contents, but also grapple with transversing this limited language comprehension in a context that affords them very little support, if any. But as Freire and Macedo remind us, language policies are never neutral in that they are deeply marred in asymmetrical relations of power. It is no wonder, then, that language constitutes such a fiercely contested terrain of struggle. Instructional language is implicated in significant ways when considering the future possibilities and limitations that students will experience not only in the classroom, but in the world. Similarly, community conditions that infuse life, meaning, and belonging are also key factors in the academic formation, given that language rights, cognitive justice, and democratic participation are absolutely essential for community empowerment and democratic life. However, when human conditions shaped by a long-standing history of oppression and marginalization when these have been ignored or disregarded or maligned within schools, the political empowerment and well-being of our kids are absolutely compromised. Unfortunately, the linguistic forms of racialization at work in the schooling of English language learners, or what Ángela Valenzuela terms subtractive schooling, disrupts their ability of both educators and policymakers to see beyond the shrouded projections of inferiority. There's a sense like these kids are not able to learn, like they're not really able to learn, or there's the sense of always questioning their intelligence. But the sad thing is that it's such an embedded, the colonial matrix is so embedded in their own cognitive formation that they're not even aware that they're already sentencing these kids to not achieve. 50 years ago, Albert Memmi posited an acerbic critique about the coloniality of power in his seminal text, The Colonized and the Colonizer. In this critique, Memmi forthrightly pointed to the inhumanity of racism and the colonialist praxis. In so doing, he called attention to the cruelty and ferocity of Western imperialism and the counterfeit legitimacy and monopoly ascribed to mechanisms of knowledge production that sustain colonialism. Hence, what is our task at hand? If we understand it as part of a long-standing colonial project, then we have to understand that it is about how we engage the coloniality of power that it still endures in schools today as we decolonize our minds from debilitating ideologies that persistently dehumanize students who do not speak standard English, judging them in need of remediation, yet unworthy of the expenditures of additional resources. In the logic of race to the top or no child left behind, as well as the Common Core, the underlying goal of education is to create the global competition, the competitive edge that can ensure domination of the world's political economy at the expense of our children. What I'm saying is that rather than be so concerned for that economic, domination, that perhaps we need to move back and start again and be thinking about the humanity of our children, not just language minority children. I'm speaking about those children because that's my research in this moment. But I mean this across all, because I don't believe that the majority of children in this society are thriving in the ways that they could. Meanwhile, expenditures of educational resources are liberally being directed towards, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, including in the early years, in the government's frenzy to meet its overwhelming, overarching goal. In this world of high-stakes accountability, the STEM initiatives are somehow now the panacea for global supremacy, while questions of cultural democracy have simply been eclipsed. In accordance, linguistic racialization is implicated as part of a larger, more complex system of economic and political subordination. And this encompasses a worldview that can easily distort the ability to see these children as fully worthy of educational rights. The consequence is this perpetuation of culture of educational neglect that relegates our communities to an untenable position of invisibility despite our growing numbers. What we have here is the exacerbation of lingual racism. Within schools, the impact that this has. For those of you that, I'm sure that there's many that are sitting in the audience. You're working with the kids, you're working in communities. You know what I'm talking about. This is not, I'm not being inflammatory. I wish it was just a matter of being inflammatory. And all of this is backed off with research. This is you want to talk about research-based. What we start to see is the manner in which research gets used in ways that support a particular agenda. My agenda is around the issue of cultural democracy. And despite the fact that our children now comprise 50 to 90% of the total student population in some districts, there's been this stubborn reluctance to assert the communal dimension of language beyond English in the U.S. What happens often when we talk to people about wanting to really engage this question of language, we'll have people retort and say that, oh my gosh, well, we've got 100 languages in our schools. But language is it's a communal relationship. If you have 65% of your kids speaking Spanish, you have a big chunk of the population speaking Spanish, and that means that the relationship, historical and communal, is different. If you have a large area where the kids are speaking Portuguese or Creole, that's, you can't act like that's the same thing like having one kid who came from India. I'm not saying that that's not important. I'm just saying you can't pretend that it's the same relationship. Central to these histories that we're trying to engage here is very much the sense of, how do we understand that this country is not monolingual? This is not a monolingual country. And this country is now more linguistically diverse than ever. If we are to genuinely then move beyond a culture of forgetting, this will require that we fully challenge the political economy and the cultural hegemony that undergirds restrictive language policies in the U.S. For educational leaders to do this effectively, Micaela Di Leonardo argues we must transcend our disciplinary and very American culture of forgetting in order to connect and to recontextualize our own histories, to embrace openly as scholars and citizens the critical analysis of the histories of the present-day realities of power and powerlessness. This is to say that without a systemic engagement of the political economy, motivations, and ideological intentions of cultural hegemony and its destructive impact on language rights everywhere, our efforts towards language and pedagogical emancipation will be just constantly derailed by a politics of forgetting. We exist in a world where the wiles of neoliberalism are securely bolstered by epistemicides of the free market that overwhelmingly abstract our physical, cultural existence, deeming the disposable targets of exploitation for the marketplace, undermining the potential for genuine human rights. In the process, the dynamic vitality of our cultural lives, our labor, our dreams are usurped daily by the money gods that today rule our country. And if we don't think the money gods rule the country, just start reading Political Economy today and really look at how the resources are being used. Look who holds the resources and who's making decisions about the majority of the world's population. In the face of this impunity, because I call it a sort of impunity, the kind of racism we deal with, and a multiplicity of callous and brazen assaults upon our humanity, we can never be naive nor cavalier in confronting the overwhelming forces negating the legitimacy of our long drawn-out historical struggles for social justice. Instead, our political praxis must be both epistemologically fierce and deeply anchored in the sensibilities garnered from our own histories of oppression, the only place from which we can truly rid ourselves of the heavy yoke of Eurocentric tyrannies over our language and our histories. And by transforming our powerlessness, we as educators and cultural workers together can gain the critical coherence and wherewithal to begin anew in this necessary campaign for language rights and cultural rights. This entails a recognition that we cannot keep reforming and subjecting our children to a fundamentally bankrupt system of schooling, a system shrouded in the capitalist and colonial project which strips our children of their humanity, their culture, their language, and their innate right to be the very creators of their own destinies. Thank you.
Magnificent presentation, and it came in just as the clock hit all zeros on the timer. Dr. Paraskiva has some remarks to make in following this magnificent presentation, and then we'll probably have time for Q&A, and I've been asked to help you remember to go to the microphone because this is being a live-streamed program. So.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to produce this discussion for Antonio Dada's keynote address, which I wish the room was packed. It's like a contradiction with the theme of the conference. So it's an honor. I decide to title my sort of draft to Antonio's keynote address, challenge the epistemicide, Antonio Dada's ruthless critique of eugenic hegemonic epistemologies. Antonio Dada's address today lays out the real colors weaving and yielding the ideological matrix of what she insightfully announces and denounces as, and I quote, linguistic genocide, and what contemporary decolonial and southern theorists such as Quijano, Mignolo, Dussel, Santos, Walsh, and others frame as coloniality, or better said, colonialities. Coloniality, Mignolo claims, is like the unconscious in Freud. That is, you don't see it, but it works. No se ve, pero trabaja. Or it's like la pluralité in Marx. That is, you don't see it, but it functions. No se ve, pero funciona. That is, coloniality is the logic that underpins the Western Eurocentric hegemonic civilization since its emergence. Dada frames a critical neo-Gramscian exegesis on language, hegemonic battles, and the politics of forgetting, dissecting four major Western modern Eurocentric swamps, namely linguistic genocide, the materiality of hegemonic and counter-hegemonic languages, the ideological nexus language schooling, and the cultural politics of forgetting. Dada maps out dominant and counter-dominant language struggles as an international phenomenon, situates linguistic oppression within the scaffold of neoliberal cultural power, pillars language issues beyond the pale neoliberal technique, that is, language wrangles are informed by material aspects and not just pedagogical and methodological issues, and examines linguistic dispositions not as a pale cultural corner, but as a cognitive disposition as well. In examining the linguistic genocide perpetrated by Western Eurocentric hegemonic platforms, Dada announces and denounces such eugenicist philosophy of praxis, and I quote, legitimized in the name of God and the name of the nation, end of quote, a praxis of racial and ethnic cleansing that needs to be contextualized as part of the greatest genocide in human history, end of quote. That is, the butchering of millions of Native Americans and other oppressed communities throughout the world. Is this just one part of the genocide? The other part of the genocide, to invite Sousa Santos to our conversation, was the systematic attack and destruction of any linguistic form beyond the Western Eurocentric platform. A linguistic genocide represented carried in the US schools in the form of the English-only movement, the Common Core, the high-stakes testing policies, etc. Furthermore, what we have here, and Dada insightfully unveils, is a full blast colors of the epistemicide. The notion of the epistemicide was coined by Portuguese sociologist Boaventura Sousa Santos, and as he understands as the suppression of peasant, indigenous, and other rival knowledges and languages, and the systematic elimination of alternative knowledges where power is used to subordinate peripheral and semi-peripheral countries and oppressed communities to Western Eurocentric imperialism. The epistemicide is at the very core of the coloniality that goes beyond, way beyond, the issue of colonialism. Dada addresses, edifies a merciless critique to the real metamorphoses and outcomes of such epistemicide in our schools, a process of official linguistic, cultural, and ethnic cleansing, rubber-stamped by educational acts flooded with sliding signifiers, as Laclau would put it, such as No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, and Common Core, that have been able to violently impose, both secularly and religiously, a coloniality of power, being, knowledge, and labor. Dada expands such epistemicide within and beyond the global north and the global south skeleton, grasping and situating it precisely at the very core of the global north as in the south and the global south as in the north. In so doing, she contextualizes the extermination of Native Americans within the complex board of imperial colonialism, which cannot be fully understood without meticulous discerning how oppressed communities, such as the Basques, the Gallegos, the Catalans, in what was hegemonically geographicalized as Spain, as well as other indigenous populations of Africa, Australia, New Zealand, India, Latin America, and the US, have been systematically terminated physically and or linguistically and thus cognitively. Moreover, Dada actually unmasked how such linguistic genocide has naturalized, domesticated, anesthetized, and trivialized people to a point that oppressed communities end up losing, and I quote, their linguistic connection to their ancestral language, end of quote. Western Eurocentric colonial metrics imposed commonsensically a set of eugenic public policy discourses to a point that racism manifested throughout the process of linguistic racialization, or should one say cleansing, is intrinsically linked to political economical power, control of natural resources, and subordination of those interiorized as other. Dada dismembers our racialized educational policies and philosophy of praxis, fabricate a specific social identity anchored in what Ramon Grasfugal calls epistemic privilege. Epistemic privilege in our schools and curriculum, as Dada dissects, has been legitimized by the judicious production and reproduction of invisibilities of oppressed racial, linguistic, and cultural communities based on Eurocentric eugenic cult. As Quijano argues, one of the key features of the global power within the colonial modern Eurocentric capitalist phase is the social classification of the world's population among the idea of race, a mental construction that expresses the basic experience of colonial domination and pervades the more important dimensions of global power, including its specific rationality, which is Eurocentrism. Interacting with Balibar and Wallenstein and their notions of selection/election, Dada neo-Gramscianism brings ideology back to the table by examining how ideology and ideological has been the cultural and linguistic suppression of oppressed populations, shockingly justifiable under an organic understanding of science and the scientificity of science within what is called a moribund democratic society. Relying on the power of the personal, Dada explains how, as a young child in East Los Angeles, she was punished for violating the unwritten English only ruled in the school. Her story goes beyond the attack on the scientificity of science, despite how important that degree is, and challenged ideologically without any euphemisms, the psychologization, technification, and dehistorization of restrictive language policies. In so doing, not only that she reinforced ideology, that ideology is not only with very much as today, representing just as powerful as a force as it did a century ago, but also she situates the struggle against the linguistic and cultural racism within the iron curtain of ideology and not within the cultural velvet of culture. In fact, Dada approaches implicitly testifies any attempt to de-ideologize racial language policies in our educational system is an ideological claim. The racial and intentional lethal attack on linguistic and cultural oppressed communities, it is an ideological position. As she argues, and I quote, the ideological racism informs restrictive language policies constitutes an inherently political strategy of exclusion, domination, and exploitation, firmly entrenched within the wider systemic necessity of capitalist modes of production that fuels restrictive policies and practice within the schools and the labor market in an effort to sustain the interests of capital and simultaneously well economic consequences these policies produce, end of quote. This examination of the ideological scientificity of science that portrays the cultural and linguistic frameworks of oppressed communities is not a minor footnote in the eugenic tradition of Western Eurocentric, as the work of Selden and others testify, and as Professor Dada actually insightfully explained today. In fact, the scientific base of the inferiority of certain linguistic oppressed communities was argued by some of the most top Western Eurocentric intellectuals, some of them labeled as humanists like Kant, Hegel, and many others. Such communities were cornered in a painful, labeled underdeveloped position, a barbarian stage which required strong mechanisms with the use of force if needed and inclusive extermination if they refuse, as people history alerted us, to expose, immerse, and radically transform those so-called inferior linguistic communities to a superior language and culture. Immigration, Dada so well explains us, was and still is a social construction, and an oxymoron, which is an oxymoron in a free, globalized world. To protect the racial stock, as she quote, from any inferior racial virus disseminated by the so-called, and I quote, and she quote, the uncivilized, ignorant, and dangerous, end of quote, immigrant populations. Under such eugenic language policies, Dada stresses, racialized oppressed communities are unmercifully ushered into a culture of forgetting, in which such oppressed communities are expressed to reject their native tongue and uncritically adopt the language of culture system imposed upon them by a culture of hegemonic schooling. Further, she states, nowhere in this formulation is the intention of transforming conditions of inequality experienced by language minority populations beyond aspiration to individual material success as the most important personal value. In fact, Dada points out that the official attack on cultural and linguistic thesaurus of racialized communities legitimize what Valenzuela calls subtractive schooling, as she explains today. Under the guise of neoliberalism, racialized language policies saw an unprecedented increase in the process of the sink or swim philosophy, as she explained, tied to the market enterprise, not only linguistic rights debates in an arena of public educational language policy, but also concomitantly create and legitimize xenophobic perceptions of the other that have been aggravated due to job scarcity and subsequent competition between working class populations. Needless to say that the attacks on cultural and linguistic rights have increased incarceration numbers of working class men and women of color. The silent ethnic cleansing on oppressed communities of color is a crime against humanity, one that forces out young kids of such communities and criminalizes them. Schools and curriculum, as Professor Dada unveiled, are part of the power matrix of coloniality that produces and reproduces the hegemonic mind of eugenic dominance and control. The hegemonic cult anchored shockingly on an eugenic claim that such epistemological perspective is unique and the only truth possible, into a cognitive fashion that collapsed in what Sousa Santos termed as abyssal thinking. The system, abyssal thinking is a system of belief, a system of visible and invisible distinctions, the invisible ones being the foundation of the visible ones. The invisible distinctions are established throughout the radical lines that divide social reality in two realms, the realm of this side of the line and the realm of the other side of the line. What most fundamentally characterizes abyssal thinking is thus the impossibility of co-presence of the two sides of the line. To the extent that it prevails, this side of the line only prevails by exhausting the field of relevant reality of the other side of the line. Beyond this line, beyond this abyssal line, there is only non-existence, invisibility, non-dialectical absence. This is what actually Dada is referring to when she argues linguistic racialization is implicated as part of the larger complex system of economic and political subordination that positions language minority students and their families as disposable second-class citizens, end of quote. Such abyssal thinking, as she clearly unveils, pervades our schools and, open quotes, perpetuates a culture of failure and educational neglect that relegates our communities to a position of invisibility, end of quote. To challenge the coloniality of abyssal thinking that flourish on the eugenic claim that social justice can only be achieved with cognitive justice, it is important, Dada argues, to decolonize our minds from debilitating ideologies that persistently racialize students of color who do not speak English, end of quote. She is asking to decolonize the very Western Eurocentric epistemological framework in which dominant and counter-dominant groups have been working. Paradoxically, the fact that racialized linguistic and cultural communities have to announce and denounce the epistemicide and linguistic genocide perpetrated by the oppressor in the language of the oppressor speaks volume of the sadistic role of the educational institutions. Thus, to go beyond the cult of forgetting, as Dada so eloquently unveils, accurately, this implies a desprendimento total, meaning to delink, as she claims, and I quote, to delink from the principles of structure supporting the existing system of knowledge and humanities. Decolonial thinking questions the rhetoric justifying the role of the social sciences and the humanities as well as their methodology. Decolonial thinking calls into question the disciplinary legitimacy of knowledge that and the disqualification of knowledge that does not obey to the existing disciplinary rules. That is, decolonial thinking is a commitment to unlearn in order to relearn, as Mignolo claims. Maldonado Torres and Smith call this epistemological disobedience. Such epistemological disobedience, and I'm ending, is not only, as Dada critique suggests, if one is committed, sorry, the light is very bad, I have to... such epistemological disobedience is only possible, as Dada's critique suggests, if one is committed to, and I quote from Marx, to a ruthless critique of every epistemology that exists, end of quote. It is a call for a new philosophical and epistemological consciousness, one that clearly must not be afraid of its own conclusions, nor in conflict with the powers that be. In this sense, decoloniality is not just a call to interrupt the Cartesian model of Western Eurocentric modernity. It offers a different solution for addressing human oppression, insisting that we cannot have social justice without cognitive justice. Dada's address comes in the most appropriate momentum as the legacy of coloniality continues to reborn more fiercely through the neoliberal schooling. Dada's approach is one of hope as well, since while it is very difficult to imagine the end of the epistemicide, it is also certainly even more difficult to imagine that it will not end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have time for 2 or 3 questions or comments, and if you would come to the microphone, we would appreciate that. Good. Dr. Darter, I think maybe you should stand up there.
Antonia, I've had the privilege of hearing you speak many times. In fact, a few years ago, I was at a roundtable with you at AERA, which means I had a lot of interaction, and it was wonderful. I think you heal me as well as incite me to do more. So I want to move to another continent for a minute. I'm involved in a project in South Africa, and I've been there many, many times, and we have educators going back and forth. And 20 years after apartheid, we're in South Africa living through the hegemonic language issue. Afrikaans in English is the language of privilege. And we see all the other language that historically bound the people together, they're marginalized. Right. So if folks want to send their children to a better school, they either have to speak Afrikaans and English. In fact, some of the best universities, like University of Stellenbosch, which is arguably the best and finest university in all of Africa, if you don't speak Afrikaans and English, all the professors must speak Afrikaans and English. So my question to you is it possible that every country that tries to replicate what we have in the United States ultimately marginalizes folks and languages, because that's the very nature of capitalism, that's the very nature of competition, because the next thing you're going to get is marginalized languages? Thank you.
Right. I mean, it's a great question. And I hope that in my presentation, I was exactly attempting to signal that, exactly your question. And that's that what we have to understand is if you export an epistemology, if you export a way of thinking of the world and a way of then organizing the world and making meaning of the world, you're going to keep getting the same results. So the issue then for us is how do we begin to think in very different ways? And I think in many ways, I want to really thank Jean Paraskiva, because in the work that he is doing is so much around really looking at the question of curriculum and really understanding the manner in which Eurocentric curriculum is so tied to an epistemology that does not permit, with all the rhetoric of human rights, it does not permit cultural democracy, it does not permit human rights, because of exactly as he pointed out, the line is so thick, in a sense, demarcated, and this sense that what exists over there is rendered invisible and therefore not existent. So you keep repeating the same piece. We cannot change our schools, we cannot change wherever you go in the world, you cannot change the system of schooling unless we start thinking differently, and that means we have to create different priorities. We need to think in very multidimensional ways, and we need to begin to bring those cultures and those languages and those ways of thinking and being the world that have been excluded into the center. And we have to stop with a culture of conquest. We don't realize that the culture of conquest in so many ways impacts the way we think about solutions or the way we think about fixing educational problems. So we're looking for that one solution. The truth of the matter is that human beings create their context, and if you're going to force them into a particular way of being, what you're going to do there is then be involved in a process of cultural invasion, which is what I'm hearing you say is essentially being replicated in South Africa.
Dr. Antonia Darter, first I have a comment, which is I'm incredibly moved and thankful for your words. I think that the passion, ardor, and strength of your words is sorely missing from a lot of the presentations in the conference, and I think it's because my name is Claudia Von Vacano. I'm from UC Berkeley. I study policy, and I'm interested in language policy specifically. And there's a natural contradiction between my program, Policy Organizations, Measurement and Evaluation, and my interest in language policy and restrictive language policy. And I think that it's extremely challenging. I think what you speak to is how extremely challenging it is to intersect or interject ideas of ideology and language ideology when they're being so systematically marginalized. When the conversation is about the Common Core, and in California, there are positive things about the Common Core. However, I think there's still fear to take a stance and to say the use of primary language is essential. We have a huge population that's Spanish-speaking. We need to have teachers that speak Spanish. And so I just kind of want to engage you on the level of where, I'm a very practical person, and I want to, I'm about rolling up my sleeves and trying to find the way. Where do you start to engage that on a very practical level?
Yeah, well, again, I will always shy away from giving formulaic answers. And the reason for that is that I am very much committed to a truly democratic process of engaging our communities and creating solutions that are truly anchored in our own communities. So what that leads me to is that if we want to make those changes, then we need to work within our communities, and we have to bring the people who are most affected by those policies and practices to the table, right, and begin to engage in that way. And in that process, it had the work that we do, the influence that we have, wherever we have that influence, that has to be enough. I mean, the sense that there's always this tendency, and this is part of the problem of this, of even in many ways replicated, is that people are looking for like one size fits all. And in a lot of ways, what I'm hearing you say is that you recognize that the one fits all, it does not work. So it means that we've got to begin to create a different dialogue, a different protocol, a different way of engaging these questions at both the site of policy and the site of practice. And we can't do it alone. We need to bring all those who are most affected by those decisions to the table.
So, is there another question? Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonia. It's so inspiring all the time to hear you, to read you. I just love you, frankly.
Like two friends.
Absolutely. Once again, another international context, from South Africa to India.
Right.
The context I'm most familiar with. It's a very interesting situation over there with regards to policy and practice on the ground. Post-independence, the policy at the policy level was very much into indigenizing languages in school in different parts, and it's a very multilingual society. There are so many languages, right? So, but there's this rising, and this is part of my own research also, I found out, demand from the parents themselves. Like my own parents, they all studied in vernacular language schools, working class parents. They struggled throughout their entire life. So I'm the first person they sent me into an English school, and when I saw your picture about your experience of being punished, I have been through similar experience in India, in English medium school, and being the first person in my family to be in an English medium school, it was worse. So I was just wondering, and now as part of my own research, it seems like the pressure from the ground is increasing even more.
Absolutely.
Parents are demanding more and more to to convert schools into completely English medium. So there's this contradiction, you know. So how do you deal with situations like this?
Well, the way that I take on that kind of question is essentially is that, you know, we do all this writing about hegemony, and then when we have to engage hegemony, the outcome of hegemony, what it looks like is this. This is the impact of hegemony, that parents are asking to be stripped, have their children stripped of their language and their culture, but it's not because they're bad parents. And they themselves have been inculcated in a colonial, discourse. And parents love their children. They want the best for their children. So if they repeatedly are hearing that the best thing for their children is to go to an English-speaking school, to be educated in English, that the language, that their language doesn't have any worth, any value, then you're going to see that a good parent is going to do that. So I think it signals more than anything is that we as educators cannot think of our political work as simply in the classroom. That we have a responsibility to be involved with parents, that parents are workers, that we are workers, and that we need to create this type of dialogue, but also of working together and engaging these questions with parents. Because where do they get to have those conversations? Where do they get, and it's not a matter of going and saying to them, oh, you're wrong. It's wrong for you to have. No, it's not that. It's beginning to have the conversation about where did you come to believe? From where did you come to believe that? Let's talk, what do you feel when you speak your own language? You create a place. That's part of the political work. I think we always want to jump over the deep relational political work that has to be done in our communities. And we have to understand that we can't jump, because if we jump, all we do is indoctrinate. That's part of the issue. I'm not interested in indoctrinating, for example, parents, that kind of stuff. I'm interested in engaging parents in ways that they begin to think about what has caused them to come to a place where they themselves would participate in the genocide of their own language and their own culture. And there's no easy way to do that. We've got to do it on the ground. So I think that right now, with the time we have, that we can talk more about that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you.